Okay, so I just finished reading the intro to Terry Martin's book, The Affirmative Action Empire, and I am genuinely reeling. Did you know the Soviet Union was actually the world's first affirmative action empire?
It sounds like a total oxymoron, right? You think Soviet Union, you think iron fist, total control. But in the 1920s, they were doing the exact opposite with ethnic minorities.
Exactly. I mean, Martin says they were the first multi-ethnic state to respond to nationalism by promoting it. Like they literally tried to build up national consciousness on purpose.
Right, because they saw decolonization as inevitable. They figured if they didn't lead the parade would just march right out of the old Russian Empire.
Wait, so they weren't just being nice? It was a cold, calculated strategy to keep the territory together?
Oh, absolutely. It was what Martin calls a prophylactic strategy. They wanted to prevent the growth of hostile nationalism by giving people the forms of nationhood first.
So what did that actually look like on the ground? Because the scale he describes is it's insane.
It was massive. We're talking tens of thousands of national territories. They were training new national elites, making local languages official, even creating written scripts for languages that didn't have them.
They created alphabets just so people could have their own newspapers and operas in their own language?
Exactly. Books, journals, movies, the whole 9 yards. Martin points out that outside of maybe India later on, no other state has ever matched this level of state-sponsored affirmative action.
But, okay, how do they sell this to the hardcore communists? I mean, shouldn't a good Marxist be all about workers of the world unite, not let's celebrate our ethnic differences?
Well, that's where it gets spicy. There was a huge fight at the 8th Party Congress in 1919. You had guys like Piatakov and Bukharin basically saying, this is a diplomatic game. Nationalism is counter-revolutionary.
Yeah, Piatakov said it was worse than a game if they actually took it seriously. He thought the only will that mattered was the proletariat's, not some national will.
But Lenin was the one who really pushed back. He basically called them out, saying, scratch any communist and you find a great Russian chauvinist.
Oh, snap. He really went there.
He did. He argued that the only way to overcome the deep distrust people had toward Great Russia as an oppressor was to acknowledge their right to self-determination. It was about building trust.
So there's this Marxist premise Martin talks about, the idea that nationalism is just a mask for social grievances.
Right, the wrong address theory. Like the message of history was intended for classes, but by some terrible postal error, it was delivered to nations instead.
That's such a great analogy. So the Bolsheviks thought if they gave people their national costume, as Stalin put it, the mask would eventually fall off and reveal the class struggle underneath?
Precisely. Stalin loved that masking metaphor. He figured if the state provided the form of nationhood, it would cleanse it of its bourgeois filth and leave behind a Soviet-friendly version.
It's so paradoxical. We're going to develop your national culture to its maximum so that it exhausts itself and we can all be internationalists. It sounds like trying to cure someone's sweet tooth by forcing them to eat 10 cakes.
That's actually a perfect way to put it. They called it the modernization premise. They believed nationality was an unavoidable stage of history.
And Stalin was convinced of this, right? He looked at cities in Hungary and saw them go from German-speaking to Hungarian-speaking in 50 years and thought, this is a general law.
Yeah, he told the 1921 Congress that you can't go against history. He expected all the Russian cities in places like Ukraine and Belarusia to inevitably become nationalized.
I'm looking at these tables in the book, like the one about Ukrainization of the print media and employee knowledge of Ukrainian. They were really tracking this stuff meticulously.
Oh, they were obsessed with the data. They even had lists of culturally backward nationalities that got special bronya or quotas for education and jobs.
It's wild to see names like Kaganovich's Ukrainization in the table of contents. They were literally engineering whole cultures from the top down.
But it didn't stay that way. As you see later in the book, the whole thing hit a wall in the 1930s. The affirmative action empire eventually turned into ethnic cleansing and the reemergence of the Russians.
Wait, so the cake-eating strategy didn't work?
Not exactly. By 1933, they started seeing nationalism as a threat again, especially during the famine. The mask they created started looking a lot like a real face they couldn't control.
Man, I need to get into the rest of these chapters. This whole friendship of the peoples thing, starting as a giant social engineering project, it's a lot to process.
It's a rabbit hole for sure, but it explains so much about how the Soviet Union actually functioned and why it eventually fell apart.
Okay, so I was diving into this history of the early Soviet Union, and I've got to say, it is not at all what I expected. I thought they wanted everyone to just be Soviet, but it turns out they were actually obsessed with building up different nationalities.
Right? It's totally counterintuitive. You expect this big, centralized machine to crush local identities, but Lenin and Stalin actually did the opposite in the 1920s. They created what historians call an affirmative action empire.
Affirmative action? That sounds so modern. How does that even work in a 1920s communist context?
Well, it started with what they called the colonial premise. Lenin believed that the biggest threat to the revolution wasn't the small, local nationalisms, but what he called Great Russian chauvinism.
Wait, so the Russians were the bad guys in their own revolution?
In a way, yeah. Lenin literally said that Great Russian nationalism was the most dangerous of all because it was the nationalism of the former oppressor. He even coined this wild term, Russotopstvo, which basically means mindless Russian chauvinism.
Russotopstvo? That's a mouthful. So he's basically saying, hey, Russians, you need to chill out so the other groups don't hate us.
Exactly. It was called the greatest danger principle. The idea was that if you want to win over the Ukrainians, the Georgians, or the Uzbeks, you have to prove you aren't just the old Tsarist empire in a new red coat.
But I saw something in there about Stalin not being totally on board with that, or at least he had a different vibe.
Yeah, Stalin was a bit more skeptical. He actually joked that Lenin was practicing national liberalism. Stalin agreed that Russian chauvinism was a problem, but he'd seen enough in Georgia to know that small nations could be just as mean to their own minorities.
So it's like a hierarchy of who is the biggest bully. But why bother with all this? Why not just say, everyone is a worker, forget your language, forget your flag?
Because they thought nationalism was a masking ideology. They believed that if they granted the forms of nationhood, territories, languages, and local elites, the workers would realize their real interests were class-based, and the national tension would just evaporate.
It's like giving someone a toy so they'll stop crying and go to sleep.
Sort of. They called it disarming nationalism by granting the forms of nationhood. And they even used it for foreign policy. They had this Piedmont principle.
The Piedmont principle? Like the region in Italy?
Exactly the same logic. They wanted Soviet Ukraine to be so culturally attractive that the Ukrainians living across the border in Poland would want to join the Soviet Union, like a cultural magnet.
That is actually really clever. But wait, I'm reading about this Korenizatsiya thing. That sounds like a key part of this.
Oh, it was the heart of the whole thing. It translates to indigenization. It wasn't just about letting people speak their language. It was about actively forcing the state to become native.
Forcing it?
How? They literally tried to staff the local governments and schools with local people. Lenin wanted Soviet power to feel intimate and native to the peasantry, not like some Russian official coming in from Moscow to boss them around.
So if you're in Ukraine, the government should speak Ukrainian and look Ukrainian?
Precisely. And they took it to the extreme. They created this pyramid of national territories, even down to the level of national village Soviets and collective farms for tiny minorities.
But then what happens to the Russians? If everyone else is getting special treatment, where does that leave the majority?
That's the affirmative action part that's so fascinating. Bukharin, one of the top Bolsheviks, actually said that the Russians should place ourselves in an unequal position and make concessions to the others just to buy their trust.
Wait, they purposely put themselves at a disadvantage? That sounds like a recipe for resentment.
It was a huge gamble. Russians were the only major group without their own specific territory or their own national communist party. They were the state-bearing people who were told to suppress their own interests for the sake of the Union.
So, in this affirmative action empire, the empire actually works against the ruling group's culture?
In terms of form, yes. The goal was to be an anti-imperial empire. They wanted to avoid the fate of the Habsburg and Ottoman empires that collapsed because of national revolts.
It's wild to think they were building nations just to eventually get rid of the idea of nations.
Right? Stalin defined the culture as national in form, socialist in content. You can have the costumes and the language as long as the politics are strictly communist.
I wonder if that actually worked, or if they just accidentally built the very thing that would eventually break the whole thing apart.
Well, that's the big debate, isn't it? By creating these territories and elites, they were basically building the infrastructure for independent states, even if they didn't mean to.
All right, so I've been digging into this idea of the affirmative action empire. It sounds so modern, but it's actually about the early Soviet Union.
Right? It sounds like a 21st century headline, but it's really the term Terry Martin uses to describe how the Bolsheviks handled all the different nationalities after the revolution.
But wait, weren't the Bolsheviks all about workers of the world unite? Why would they want to build up separate national identities?
That's the thing. They didn't really want to. The material explains it wasn't an independent goal. It was a strategy to keep non-Russian nationalism from becoming a dangerous obstacle to their actual goals, like industrialization and nationalization.
So it was basically like, let's give them their own culture and language so they don't rebel while we're building socialism.
Exactly. It was seen as a temporary evil or a short-term concession. Most rank-and-file Bolsheviks were actually super confused by it. They were like, doesn't the Communist Manifesto say the proletariat has no fatherland?
I bet that went over well in meetings. Wait, why are we funding a Totter theater again?
Totally. There's this quote from Stalin's deputy, Peskovsky, saying that most old Bolsheviks thought revolutionary Marxists shouldn't be spreading national culture because it just divides the workers.
So there's this massive tension right from the start. How did they actually manage it without the whole thing falling apart?
They split the bureaucracy into soft-line and hard-line institutions. It's actually a brilliant, if terrifying, way to run a country.
Wait, explain that. What's the difference?
Okay, so the soft-line institutions were the public face. Their job was to look positive, creating national territories, schools, newspapers, folk music ensembles. They dealt with petitions and made things look palatable.
Okay, so they're the ones building the empire part.
Right, but then you have the hardline institutions, like the political police, the OGPU. Their job was vigilance, unmasking enemies, receiving denunciations, and making sure national pride didn't turn into actual separatism.
Did these two groups ever talk to each other?
That's the wild part. The records show they often didn't even mention each other. You'd have one office celebrating a new national museum, while the other office was literally ethnic cleansing the same group of people.
No way. That's insane. How does a local official know what to actually do?
That's where terror as a system of signaling comes in. Because the center sent so many contradictory orders, officials had to look at who was being arrested to see which policy was actually mandatory.
So if they start arresting bourgeois nationalists, you know the soft-line cultural stuff is taking a back seat.
Exactly. Terror was the ultimate signal. In Ukraine, for instance, they were told to promote the Ukrainian language, but then they launched a terror campaign against nationalists. It made officials realize that following the official policy was actually dangerous.
I noticed the text mentions a difference between East and West nationalities, too. How did that play out?
It was all about developmental stages. The Western groups, like Ukrainians, Jews, and Germans, were considered advanced. For them, the focus was just on making their language the official state language.
And the Eastern route?
They were labeled culturally backward. For them, the affirmative action was about building an elite from scratch, hiring and educating people who had never had those opportunities before.
So Ukraine seems to be the big player here. Why was it so central?
Size, mostly. Ukrainians were over 20% of the Soviet population. They were the biggest non-Russian group by far. Plus, Ukraine was a huge industrial and agricultural hub on a sensitive border.
And what about the Russians? I mean, they were the ones who started the revolution, right?
The Russian question is the most complicated part. Initially, affirmative action for everyone else meant reverse discrimination against Russians to level the playing field.
I bet that didn't last long when Stalin took full control.
You're right. After 1933, there was what they called the Great Retreat. The state rehabilitated Russian culture and made it the unifying force for the whole Soviet Union.
Wait, back up to 1932. What actually triggered that change?
It was a perfect storm. Collectivization was failing, there was a massive famine, and the leadership blamed Ukrainian nationalism for the grain shortages. They issued decrees basically ending the push for Ukrainization.
So the affirmative action phase just ended?
It was scaled back and implemented silently. It became less about promoting unique identities and more about this new idea called the friendship of the peoples, with Russia as the big brother.
It's such a cynical use of identity. Like, we'll give you a flag and a poem until you get in the way of the 5-year plan.
That's exactly it. It was always a tactic, never the goal.
Okay, so I was looking at this map of perceived corruption from 2013, and man, the post-Soviet world, it's just one big dark block. Like, strikingly shady was the term used.
Yeah, strikingly shady is a pretty blunt way to put it. But it's not just about things being broken. The author, Henry Hale, argues it's actually about this thing called patronalism.
Right, and he says it's as rich as the black earth soil in that region. But wait, he makes a point that patronismalism isn't exactly the same as corruption, right?
Exactly. They're related. Like, if you have high patronalism, you're probably going to see a lot of corruption. But patronalism is more about the social context. It's how power actually moves through personal networks.
There's this great line in there about a joke that's been around for like 200 years in Russia. Something about how the laws are super strict, but it's okay because nobody actually obeys them.
Yes, the severity of the country's laws is tempered by the fact that you need not actually obey them. It's classic. It perfectly captures that low score on the rule of law.
It's wild to think that's been a joke since the early 1800s. So this isn't just a modern thing that happened after the Soviet Union fell?
Not at all. Hale traces this back centuries. He says when these societies grew, they just extended their handcrafted rule through personal networks. Even the Mongols brought in patronal forms when they conquered the area.
So it's like a family business that just kept getting bigger until it became an empire?
In a way, yeah. When Muscovy expanded, the rulers didn't necessarily try to control every local leader directly. They just co-opted them. Like, hey, deliver these resources to me, and I'll give you selective rewards, or punish you if you're disloyal.
Wait, it says here they used to publicly whip nobles to keep them in line?
For a time, yeah. But usually it was about temptations. The central authority was basically the only place you could get real wealth, other than maybe the church.
And then they did the same thing in Central Asia and the Caucasus. They just swap out the titles but keep the local patrons in place as sub-patrons. It's like a corporate franchise model for power.
Totally. And at the top, it was all about these massive family networks. Like from 1689 to 1825, a lot of Russian politics was just the Miloslavsky family fighting the Narishkin family for the best spoils.
Wait, just two families? That's insane. It sounds like a TV drama.
Seriously. And Hale calls this a single pyramid system because ultimately everyone was trying to get closer to the Tsar, who sat at the very top.
But get this, I found the story in the text about a governor in a place called Kozlov. Apparently, the townspeople filed a formal complaint against him because he wasn't corrupt.
Oh, the poor guy. Yeah, Brian Davies documented that. The people were basically saying, if you don't take our bribes, how are we supposed to influence you?
That is so backwards. It says he actually had to fend people off with a cudgel because they kept trying to leave gifts at his door.
They called him a sucker. In a paternal system, being honest makes you the victim of a vicious cycle of expectations. If everyone expects corruption, the guy who won't play along just breaks the system for everyone else.
Wow, okay, but there's this big debate among historians that Hale mentions. Some say the Tsar was this all-powerful despot, but others say he was just a figurehead and the nobles had all the real power. Which is it?
That's the fascinating part. Hale says they're both right. It's all about collective action.
How so? Like, if the nobles all team up, the Tsar is toast.
Exactly. But, and this is a big but, it's incredibly risky for one noble to start a rebellion. You have to be sure everyone else is going to join you. If you stick your neck out and no one follows, the Tsar will have you executed.
Right. So as long as everyone expects everyone else to obey the Tsar stays powerful.
Bingo! The Tsar is the focal point. He coordinates everyone's expectations. So he looks all-powerful, but he's actually super dependent on the nobles not realizing they could take him out if they just worked together.
And the Tsars were smart, right? They'd use divide and rule to make sure the nobles never coordinated.
Exactly. They'd play groups against each other. But every now and then it failed, like with Peter III. The elites united, he was removed, and Catherine the Great took over.
So what changed in 1917? Why did the whole pyramid just crumble?
Hale calls it a political bank run. Think about it. You had a losing war, mass grievances, and people starting to think that monarchies were outdated.
So once people stopped expecting the Tsar to stay in power, the whole thing just vanished overnight?
Precisely. Soldiers deserted, officials stopped following orders. Once the expectation of stability was gone, the pyramid just disintegrated because there was no consensus on who would be the next chief patron.
Okay, so I was reading about this idea of a failed anti-patronalist revolution, and it's kind of blowing my mind. The Bolsheviks basically set out to destroy corruption, right?
Yeah, exactly. To the true believers, communism was supposed to be this total blood transfusion for Russian society. They wanted to smash the old Tsarist system, where everything depended on who you knew.
But then the irony is that they ended up using those exact same paternal politics just to keep their heads above water. It's like they subverted their own ideals just to survive.
Totally. It's a classic signal juncture. They challenged the old way of doing things so hard, but the way they eventually failed just proves how strong that patronal norm really was.
Wait, back up a second. What did it look like when they were actually trying to be anti-patronal? Like, what was Lenin's vibe?
Well, Lenin was all about formal rules. He wanted everything based on class background, merit, and strict party discipline. He'd even use brute force against his own friends if they broke the rules.
So he was like a hardcore bureaucrat? No personal favors, just the cause?
Essentially, he spent years arguing over the tiny details of Marxism. In the beginning, these guys didn't care about building personal networks. They thought that stuff was a disease to be cured.
And that's where Stalin comes in, right? Because he wasn't exactly the brightest light of the revolution.
Not at all. People called him a gray blur. When Lenin died, everyone thought Trotsky, the charismatic army guy, or Bukharin, the star ideologist, would take over. Stalin was just seen as a technical guy.
Wait, I read this. He was the head of the Org Bureau in 1919. That's basically the head of HR, isn't it?
Yes, that was his genius. He realized that being the guy who decides who gets the low-level jobs is actually the most powerful position in a society that understands patronage.
So he just started staffing the whole party with people who owed him their careers.
Exactly. He built this massive network of clients. By the time the big party meetings happened, the room was full of his people. It created what scholars call the circular flow of power.
The circular flow of power. I love that. It sounds so corporate, yet so ominous.
It really was. He'd promote people who would then vote for him, which gave him the power to promote more people. His rivals were busy arguing about ideology, and Stalin was just building a machine.
And once he's in, it becomes a single pyramid system, right? No more competition. Just Stalin at the top using fear to keep everyone in line.
Right. He was the ultimate practitioner of divide and conquer. He even made it risky to share doubts within your own family. Remember that story about the boy, Pavel Morozov, who turned in his own father?
It's interesting because it says here that even Western scholars couldn't agree on how powerful the Soviet leader really was. Some saw him as a total dictator. Others saw Kremlin clans fighting behind the scenes.
That's because both were kind of true. The leader depended on sub-patrons, the elites, to carry out orders. If those elites all pooled their resources, they could unseat him.
But they couldn't coordinate. That's the collective action problem. The leader is the focal point that keeps them from teaming up.
Precisely. So the elites would just fight each other for the leader's favor instead. It was all about spoils and positioning for who comes next.
And this stuff went all the way down to the republics, didn't it? Like Ukraine or Uzbekistan had their own little bosses?
Oh, for sure. Especially under Brezhnev. He had this stability in cadres policy, which basically meant, as long as you're loyal to me, I won't mess with your local business.
And that's when Blatt really took off, right? That informal exchange of favors?
Yeah, Blatt was the real economy. People used it for everything. Factories, banks, bakeries. Economists even studied vodka as a black market currency.
That's wild. Okay, so everything is held together by these networks, and then Gorbachev shows up and decides to have elections?
Yeah, and that's the system breakup. By introducing elections, he unhinged everyone's expectations. Suddenly, you didn't just need the boss's favor, you needed a power base.
And the text mentions a fatal design flaw in the Soviet Federation. What was that?
It was the Russian Republic. It was way too big, more than half the population. Earlier leaders knew this, so they never let Russia have its own party boss. They were afraid that person would rival the central leader.
But Gorbachev let them elect a leader, and that leader was Boris Yeltsin.
Exactly. Yeltsin used his new position to chip away at Gorbachev's authority. He lured elites over to his side. Once the big Russian bloc moved, the whole pyramid started to crumble.
It's described as a bank run on the state. That's such a vivid image. Everyone just tries to get their assets out before the whole thing disappears.
That's exactly what it was. The sub-patrons in the other republics saw the writing on the wall and decided to become the chief patrons of their own new, smaller countries.
So the USSR collapses, but the patronalism doesn't just vanish. It's like they use the old building blocks to make new houses.
Right. 1991 was this critical juncture. Everything was in flux, but the legacy of Eurasian patronalism was so deep that it basically laid the foundation for everything that happened for the next 25 years.
It's a crazy cycle. You try to smash the system, but you end up using the system to survive. And then you just build a new version of the same system.
It's the enduring strength of the patronalistic norm. It's a tough habit to break.
Okay, so I was just reading this piece by Henry Hale on Eurasia, and he uses this word patronalism. It sounds like something out of a movie about old political machines, but he's calling it the default state for the whole region.
It kind of is. But Hale's point is that it's not a bug in the system. It's the system itself. It's this deep social equilibrium, or everyone just expects that you need a patron to get anything done.
So it's not like a secret group of people is pulling the strings from behind a curtain for 100 years?
Exactly. He actually takes a swing at those conspiracy theories. You know, the ones that say a secret network of Soviet operatives has stayed in control since 1991. He says that's just not how it works.
Wait, really? Even with someone like Putin coming from the KGB?
Right, even then. He points out that the specific networks actually die off.
The people around the czars were long gone by the time Stalin showed up. And the people Stalin leaned on, like Beria or Khrushchev, their networks didn't survive the end of the USSR either.
So the players change, but the game is identical.
Exactly. The continuity is in the expectations. People feel like the state is the only real source of patronage, and if you don't use your connections to help your family or your network, you're basically the sucker.
That sounds exhausting, like you're forced into it just to survive.
Pretty much. And he says even the Bolshevik Revolution, which was this massive, brutal attempt to break that cycle, was eventually undone by it. Stalin basically figured out how to wrap the old patronal ways in new socialist clothing.
So the ideology just became a front for the same old power games?
Yeah, the patronalistic content basically swallowed the ideology whole. And when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, the people who took over weren't usually outside revolutionaries. They were sub-patrons from the old system who knew exactly how to use the new environment to get rich and stay in power.
It's like they just rebranded the firm, but I noticed he mentioned some countries handled it differently. Like, why isn't every post-communist country exactly the same?
That's where it gets interesting. He cites the study by Herbert Kitchalt that distinguishes between patrimonial communism and formal rational communism.
Wait, formal rational? That sounds way more boring than patronalism.
It's definitely less mafia style. Places like the Czech Republic, Poland, or Hungary had different historical roots. Some were under the Habsburgs, so they were already moving away from that deep patronalism before communism even started.
Oh, so they had a head start on escaping the natural state of patronage?
Exactly. Whereas the core USSR countries, Russia, Ukraine, Central Asia, they had the strongest patrimonial legacy. Hale even includes a table showing who was most and least patronal by the end of the communist era.
Let me see. Okay, so Russia, Uzbekistan, and Ukraine are right there at the top of the most patronalistic list.
Right. And look at the other side. The Czech Republic, East Germany, Poland, they're listed as the least patronalistic. It basically predicted which countries would struggle more with corruption and the rule of law later on.
It's wild that a legacy from decades, or even centuries ago, still dictates how a guy in Moscow or Kiev thinks about his job today.
It really is. It's that social equilibrium. If everyone else is playing the patron-client game, you almost have to play it too, or you lose everything.
So it's not just about bad leaders. It's about this whole gravity of expectations that pulls everyone back in.
Exactly. Smart leaders recognize those opportunities for power and enrichment, and very few people are willing to walk away from that kind of leverage.
All right, so I finally sat down and read that long essay by Vladimir Putin, the one about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians.
Oh, it's quite a deep dive into history, isn't it? He really leans into this idea that they aren't just neighbors, but actually one people.
Yeah, he calls it a single whole. It's not just a political statement for him. He says he's firmly believed this for a long time.
Exactly. He starts all the way back with ancient Rus. He points out that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians all come from the same root.
Right, like the Rurik dynasty and the baptism of Rus. He makes it sound like this shared Orthodox faith and the old Russian language tied everyone together from Ladoga to Kiev.
And he quotes the tale of bygone years, calling Kiev the mother of all Russian cities. He's really making the case that the center of gravity was always shared.
But then things got messy, right? With the Mongol invasion and Batu Khan?
Totally. Everything fragmented. The Northeast stayed somewhat sovereign under the Golden Horde, but the South and West ended up as part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania.
Wait, I notice he points out that even Lithuania was called the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Russia in old record.
Right. He's arguing that even when they were politically divided, the people still saw themselves as part of the same territory. They spoke the same language and stayed Orthodox.
But then the West, Poland and Lithuania, started pushing Catholicism, right? He mentions the Union of Lublin and the Polonization of the elite.
Exactly. That's where the friction starts in his narrative. He describes it as this process of ousting orthodoxy, which led to a big liberation movement in the 17th century.
That brings up Bohdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossack leader who eventually asked Moscow for help.
Right. Khmelnytsky was struggling for autonomy from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. When the Cossacks weren't heard, they turned to the Russian Tsar for protection.
And the essay says that in 1654, they specifically referred to themselves as Russian Orthodox people when they swore allegiance.
Yeah, and that's a huge point for him. He argues that the term Ukraine actually just meant periphery or borderland back then, not a separate nation.
No way! So he's saying the identity itself was originally just about living on the frontier?
That's his take. He says Ukrainians were basically frontier guards. Meanwhile, the lands that joined Russia, which he calls Malorossia, supposedly thrived.
He even brings up culture, like Nikolai Gogol. He says Gogol was a Russian patriot from Ukraine who wrote in Russian but used all these local folk motifs.
Right. He asks, how can this heritage be divided? To him, the literary and cultural history is totally inseparable.
Okay, but then he mentions those 19th century decrees that restricted the Ukrainian language, the Valuev Circular.
Yeah, he doesn't ignore those, but he claims they were just temporary measures to counter Polish influence. He argues that a Malo-Russian identity was actually developing naturally within the greater Russian nation.
So when does the idea of a completely separate Ukrainian nation show up, according to him?
He blames the Polish elite and later the Austro-Hungarians. He says they latched onto this narrative in the late 19th century to weaken Russia.
And then the Soviet era happens. He seems really critical of how the Bolsheviks handle things.
Oh, he's very blunt about that. He says the Bolsheviks robbed Russia by drawing arbitrary borders and giving away territorial gifts.
Like Crimea. I think he mentions that was handed over in 1954 in violation of the rules at the time.
Exactly. And he says Lenin's plan for a federation of equal republics with the right to secede was like a time bomb planted in the state's foundation.
So his argument is basically that modern Ukraine is entirely the product of the Soviet era.
Precisely. He even quotes Anatoly Sobchak, saying that if a republic leaves the Union, it should return to the borders it had before it joined.
Which would mean giving back all that gifted land. That's a massive claim.
It is, and he argues that Russia has actually supported Ukraine since 1991, providing tens of billions in budget savings through cheap energy and transit fees.
But then he says the current Ukrainian leaders have chosen to rewrite history and edit out everything that unites the two countries.
Yeah, he's really bothered by what he calls the anti-Russia concept, the idea that Ukraine is being used as a springboard or a barrier by the West.
It's a lot to process. It sounds like he's saying the only way for Ukraine to be truly sovereign is in partnership with Russia. So I was reading through those later sections of Putin's essay on Russia and Ukraine, and man, he really doesn't hold back on the geopolitical stuff.
No, he really doesn't. He basically argues that Ukraine was systematically dragged into this game to turn it into a barrier or a springboard against Russia.
Right, he uses this term anti-Russia. He says it's a concept Russia will never accept.
And he traces it back way further than you'd think, linking it to old Polish-Austrian ideologists who wanted to create an anti-Moscow Russia.
Wait, so he's saying this isn't even a new thing? That it's an old project being revived?
Exactly, and he's super critical of the 2014 events, calling it a coup where Western countries directly interfered.
He even says the West cynically exploited real public discontent over socio-economic problems just to push their own agenda.
Yeah, and he claims that radical nationalist groups became the battering ram for that policy, leading to what he calls blatant Russophobia.
It's wild how much focus he puts on the language issue. He mentions the repeal of state language laws and the education law that cut Russian out of schools.
He sees that as a forced change of identity. He actually compares forced assimilation to the use of weapons of mass destruction.
That is a heavy comparison. I mean, comparing a language law to a WMD is intense.
It really shows how high he thinks the stakes are. He believes it leads to a literal decrease in the Russian people by millions.
And then there's the whole thing with the church. He talks about secular authorities interfering in church life and causing a split.
Right. Even though the Ukrainian Orthodox Church had autonomy, he says the goal was to destroy the centuries-old symbol of kinship with the Moscow Patriarchate.
I notice he gets really specific about historical figures, too, contrasting Red Army heroes with people like Bandera and Mazepa.
Yeah, he calls the current glorification of those figures a betrayal of the grandfathers who fought in the Great Patriotic War.
He lists specific names like the pilot Ivan Kozadub and the sniper Ludmila Pavlichenko. He's clearly trying to tap into that shared Soviet pride.
But then he pivots to the conflict in Donbass, and his take is that the anti-Russia project is what caused the civil war there.
He mentions the 13,000 victims there. It's a tragedy he blames squarely on the Kiev authorities and their bloody provocations.
He's convinced that Kiev doesn't actually want Donbass back because the people there will never accept the new order.
Wait, so he thinks the Minsk agreements are the only way, but he claims Ukraine is just pretending to follow them?
Exactly. He says they play the victim of external aggression to keep their Western patrons happy.
And he's really suspicious of those patrons. He talks about the military development of Ukraine and NATO infrastructure being deployed there.
He even links the law on indigenous peoples to NATO exercises, which is an interesting connection to make.
He also goes after the economy, saying Ukraine is being exploited for its natural resources and saddled with debts for generations.
He basically describes a country under direct external control, where the security services and armed forces are supervised by foreign advisors.
It's a very grim picture. He's saying that even if the presidents change, the anti-Russia system remains the same.
And anyone who wants dialogue or reconciliation is labeled a pro-Russian agent and intimidated or worse.
It sounds like he thinks the whole foundation of modern Ukrainian statehood is built on hate and anger.
But he ends on this note of partnership. He claims that true sovereignty for Ukraine is only possible in partnership with Russia.
Because in his view, they are one people with the same historical sources.
He says Russia has never been and will never be anti-Ukraine. He leaves it up to the citizens to decide what their country will be.
It's a powerful argument for unity, but man, it really highlights how differently the two sides see the last decade.
Totally. It's like two completely different realities being described.
Okay, so I was just reading this piece by Dmytro Kuleba, and he is really pushing to retire the term post-Soviet space, like he wants it gone for good.
Honestly, it's about time. He argues it's been 30 years, and that label just lumps totally different countries into one bucket, which is exactly what the Kremlin wants.
Right, it makes them all look like they're still in Russia's backyard. He says that using that term actually helps Putin's narrative that Russians and Ukrainians are one nation.
Exactly. Putin calls the fall of the Soviet Union a catastrophe. But for people in Ukraine, Kuleba says it was a liberation. Total opposite perspectives.
It's wild because you see how different their paths have been. Like the Baltic states jumped into NATO and the EU years ago, while Ukraine and Georgia kind of stayed outside the door.
And they paid for it. Kuleba points out that because they weren't integrated, they both ended up facing Russian military attacks. It's a heavy point to make.
So he's basically saying, hey, the West needs to stop looking at us through this old lens and actually give us a roadmap for NATO and the EU membership.
Precisely. He's firm about it. He thinks institutionalizing Ukraine's place in the West is the only way to recognize the actual reality on the ground.
Wait, but what about the people there? I mean, 30 years is a long time. Is there still a lot of nostalgia for the old system?
That's the thing. He mentions how millions of young Ukrainians have never lived a single day in the Soviet Union. To them, Ukraine hasn't gained independence. It has always been independent.
That's a huge shift. 2 revolutions, 2004 and 2014, and then an ongoing war. These kids are literally forged in a completely different fire than their parents.
Right, and Kuleba says no government in Kyiv would ever dare treat its citizens with a heavy hand now, because the people have already changed the country's trajectory.
But let's talk strategy. If I'm sitting in Washington or Brussels, what's the actual buy-in for me, besides just feeling good about democracy?
Oh, he goes deep on that. First, security in the Black Sea. Ukraine, Georgia, Turkey, they're critical for keeping trade routes open, while Russia is militarizing Crimea.
True, and he mentions something called the Associated Trio. What's that about?
That's Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova. They've teamed up specifically to push for EU membership. It's basically them saying, we're doing the work, now let us in.
I didn't realize they were that coordinated. But, okay, if Ukraine joins NATO, isn't that just a massive liability for the West?
Actually, Kuleba flips that. He says Ukraine's military has combat experience against Russian troops that no other NATO member has, like none.
Wait, that's actually a really good point. They've been on the front line since 2014. They know the tactics better than anyone else.
And it's not just the hardware. He talks about cybersecurity and fighting disinformation. Ukraine is apparently one of the best at spotting and countering Russian tactics.
No way. So they're basically a massive field lab for modern hybrid warfare?
Basically. And then there's the energy side. Kuleba reminds us they have the world's 3rd largest underground gas storage and tens of thousands of miles of pipelines.
I keep forgetting how vital they are for Europe's energy. But wait, didn't he mention something about green energy too?
Yeah, he's super bullish on green hydrogen from solar and wind. He thinks Ukraine can be a major player in Europe's green transition.
Wow, so it's not just wheat and gas. It's high-tech energy and food security. He says their agriculture can basically guarantee global food supplies.
But he's not just painting a rosy picture. He admits they still have to deal with the elephant in the room, corruption.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. That's always been the big hurdle for the EU, right?
Exactly. But he points to recent brave steps, like land reform and judicial bills, that let international experts help filter out shady judges.
Letting international experts vet your judges? That is a bold move. It shows some serious political will from Zelensky's government.
He says it's what the people want, and they've paid a high price for it. His final message is basically, we're doing our part, now the West needs to reciprocate.
It's a strong argument.
Stop treating them like a former something and start treating them like a current partner.
Exactly. The post-Soviet era is over. Ukraine is the West now.
Oh, that was a lot to chew on. Definitely shifts how I look at those maps.
Total perspective shift. Glad we dived into it.
Yeah, same. Talk soon.
For sure. See ya.